One summer when I was a kid on vacation in Maine with my family, I decided that I really wanted to make my own sea salt. So I lugged gallons of water from the beach to the cottage, and then I spent a beautiful summer day inside watching water boil. Eventually, all that was left in the pot was a layer of grayish powder. So I scraped it into a bowl, presented it to my family at dinner time, and it was disgusting. It was bitter and harsh, and in that moment I realized that salt was more complicated than I had originally assumed. But it wasn't until I started cooking professionally that I started to understand just how important, fascinating, and truly powerful salt is. Knowing how to use salt well in the kitchen is key to being a good cook. So let's dig in. The salt we use in the kitchen is sodium chloride, and there are basically 3 types to choose from: table salt, kosher salt, and sea salt. The big difference between these types of salt isn't flavor, it's texture, and that texture can vary dramatically based on how the salt was made. Let's look at each of these under magnification. The table salt, which is crystallized rapidly under vacuum, forms perfect little cubes. This particular kosher salt forms fine, multifaceted crystals. And this sea salt forms huge pyramid-like flakes because it was formed by slowly evaporating seawater. This isn't just pretty imagery. Salt crystal structure matters a lot in cooking. Check out this experiment. These piles of salt all weigh the same and would provide the exact same level of seasoning if added to a dish. But as you can see, the piles are different sizes. Different crystal sizes pack more or less densely into a measuring spoon. So it's really important to pay attention to the type of salt called for in a recipe. A teaspoon of table salt equals the same amount of salt as 1.5 teaspoons of Morton kosher salt and 2 teaspoons of Diamond Crystal kosher salt. Their coarse, flaky textures also means that kosher and flaky sea salts are meant to be pinched with your fingers and sprinkled by hand. When sprinkling kosher salt on, say, this beautiful ribeye, it's important to always follow this mantra: season high and dry, like my good friend, the original Salt Bae, Brian Roof. Sprinkling salt from up high with a few flicks of the wrist means we get even, gorgeous distribution like this, which is key to getting good seasoning in every bite. And the dry part, well, that refers to your fingers. If you forget to dry your hands before you reach for the salt, your fingers will look like this, and the salt distribution will look like this, and that's no good. While we're on the subject of proper seasoning, there are 2 big lessons that can dramatically improve your cooking. They are seasoning early and paying attention to temperature. First up is seasoning early. Now check out this experiment. I cooked 2 batches of beef stew and 2 batches of roasted carrots. For 1 batch of each, I added the salt right at the beginning as both recipes instructed. And for the other batch, I waited until the very end to add the salt. The batches where the salt went in at the very beginning were both delicious, really well seasoned throughout. The batches where I waited to the end, though, ended up unbearably salty. That's because in those batches, the salt had no time to penetrate the food and even out its distribution. For the stew, it was concentrated entirely in the gravy, and for the carrots, it formed a thick layer on the exterior. You will always get best results by adding salt early in the cooking process. But if you forget, don't just dump it all in at the end. Start with just 25% of the amount of the salt called for in the recipe and season to taste from there. Next up is temperature, and another experiment. My colleagues sampled chicken broth seasoned with varying amounts of salt at 3 different temperatures: 180 degrees, 90 degrees, and 45 degrees. The 90-degree sample was perfectly seasoned with 2 teaspoons of salt. It took 1.5 times as much salt for the 45-degree sample to taste as well seasoned as the 90-degree sample, and 2 times as much for the 180-degree sample to taste the same as the 90-degree sample. And here's why. The receptors on our tongue for sodium are most responsive between 85 and 95 degrees. In other words, close to the temperature of our mouths. If you go outside of that range, you'll need more salt in order to get the job done. So the big lesson here is that you want to do your final seasoning at the temperature at which the food will be served. You know what? Now that I'm laying all this out, I'm realizing I know a lot more about salt than I used to. I bet I could make a really good homemade sea salt now. Let's go to the kitchen. I'm gonna start with a gallon of fresh seawater. Now it's important to use clean water, so you don't want it from any highly polluted or populated areas. No red tide warnings, none of that unpleasant stuff. First step is I'm gonna strain it through a coffee filter. We wanna make sure there's no fish in there. Oh, looks like we're good. The water goes into an enameled Dutch oven. Now that's important. We're gonna be boiling and concentrating salt water, and salt is really corrosive. It can cause pitting even on stainless steel. Now just bring the water to a boil and start concentrating it into a brine. Now 25 years ago, I just kept going until there was no water left. But I know better now. In addition to sodium chloride, seawater contains a mix of minerals. The calcium and magnesium salts are what made my sea salt so bitter. The good news is that the calcium salts will crystallize before the sodium chloride, so it's actually pretty easy to remove them. Once they start forming on the bottom of the pot, I simply pour it into a liquid measuring cup and let it settle. Just look at all that bitter calcium we removed. Now for the crystallization stage. We just pour our concentrated brine into a shallow glass baking dish. And now we have a couple of options. We can let this hang out at room temperature and slowly crystallize, or we can speed it up in a low oven. If your salt is still bitter at this point, you can actually rinse off the bitter magnesium salts in fresh brine. Check out the recipe link below for the details on how to do that. Then we just scrape up our flaky, beautiful homemade sea salt, put it into a gorgeous jar like this, and this is how to eat salt. No. That's not how to eat salt. We already talked about how to eat salt. Don't do that. I'll see you next time. Hey salt fans, hit me up in the comments with your salty stories, and don't forget to hit subscribe. We'll see you next time.